remember a lot about my childhood.
I don't really know what reminds me of my childhood.
There are lots of things that remind me of my childhood.
Things like my plum ballet dress or the smell of hairspray reminds me of my dance shows because I'd done a lot of ballet when I was younger.
The smell of the washing powder, the washing machine on a Monday morning.
When I had my doll's house presented to me for my birthday when I was about 5.
Things like my bunk bed with my sister. We used to share a room for quite a lot of the time.
My Hornby Model Railway, Action Man. I can remember getting an Action Man, and that was great, that was. But dinky cars and corgi cars, all sorts of things like that.
Well, if I see on the television, I hear air raid sirens or aircraft and explosions, and you hear bombs dropping. That is very much a memory of my childhood because the war started 6 months after I was born. I was fostered when I was about 2 years old because my mother died, and I grew up with an elderly lady and a single daughter, and they were very firm but very fair, and I had a very happy childhood.
My childhood was really happy. We had lots of loving people surrounding us. Lots of friends and family who made it quite a cheerful and busy childhood.
My childhood was what I would call a normal childhood of someone born in the early 60s. It was fun. As a family we were reasonably wealthy or middle class, so things weren't too difficult, so it was a good childhood.
The question of how memory works is something that's been studied by thousands of researchers across the world right now and has been for decades. The reason is that it's a complicated problem and it can be approached from a number of different angles. For example, a purely psychological perspective or a neurobiological perspective, trying to understand how the brain does memory. And how the brain does memory can be studied at a number of different levels. For example, the molecules involved in memory, how cells encode memory, networks of cells, and all the way up to the anatomical organization of memory in the brain and what bits of the brain store or mediate what kinds of memory.
Memory is a very complex cognitive process that allows us to make sense of whatever exists around us, what we read, what we hear, allows us to have conversation. But I would say that most importantly, memory allows us to maintain coherence in the sense of ourselves throughout our life. And memory consists mostly of 3 stages. The first one where we perceive information from outside and we encode this information. Secondly, we store this information in the memory systems. And third, we can recall this information and use it in our daily activity.
My earliest childhood memory is when my mum was carrying me down the stairs and she slipped and fell while I was in her arms, and we both ended up at the bottom of the stairs, but I'm not sure if that was from her telling me of the story and me rebuilding it in my mind, or just from me memorising it. I think now that there's a lot of pictures about, and now that I see quite a lot of family and speak to them a lot more than what I used to, I remember a lot more things because I've had people reminding me of events or showing me events.
It's very difficult to test whether what we remember it's really a proper memory or it's more related to what we have heard from our parents. So it's very important to consider that there have been investigated many situations, and what it has been found is that a very important role in this kind of issue is played by the parents' elaborative or non-elaborative reminiscing style. Western culture, for example, mothers from Western countries have a very emotional and elaborative style, and this means that they tend to describe a lot about their past to their children, whereas mothers from Eastern cultures are very simple and not very detailed in their tendency of talking about their past. And this strongly relate with the number of memories that children have, with a lot of detailed memories in Western culture children and very few or poor memories in Eastern culture children.
It turns out that when you have a memory, when you're actually having the memory, it has the opportunity to be altered, so that you're having a particular memory about your granddad, say, and someone will provide another piece of information. You can incorporate that information into your memory, and then it gets consolidated, it's called, or reconsolidated in this case again, into long-term memory. And then from that moment on, that piece of information will be contained in that memory. Now, this becomes important and a little bit scary when you think about things like leading questions in a court case, because your actual memory can be influenced by what you're being told. So there's a famous experiment by Elizabeth Loftus and her colleagues, she's a famous person in this area, where they would ask someone, how fast was the car going when it bumped into the other car? Or they would ask, how fast was the car going when it smashed into the other car? And so the person would recall the memory of this episode differently depending on how the question is asked.
My earliest childhood memory would have been, I think, Christmas round Nan and Grandad's, and using a huge, great big cast-iron dog to crack nuts, and the kids pestering the adults all Christmas to have the nuts crushed. None of us ate the nuts, but we wanted to use the dog to crack the nuts.
I started to have a sort of nightmare when I was, I suppose, about 7, something like that. And it lasted for quite a while. And in later years, I spoke to one of my brothers, and he told me what it was. I was in the garden when I was only toddling, and the plane had split away from the main ones, came across very low over our garden, and he grabbed me, and I was up looking up at the sky, and there were bombs dropping out of the plane. And that was a nightmare I suffered for many years. But once my brother told me what it was, it eased it.
There were 3 children in the family. There was myself, who was the oldest, Jane was the middle one, and Hilary was the youngest. Hilary unfortunately was knocked down by a van when she was 4 years old. She'd been picked up from her nursery school in the village hall, and unfortunately, despite everything you can do, she decided she wanted to cross the road and got knocked down by the van. My sister Jane and myself, we were at school up at the village school in Shillington, and I can vaguely remember being called out of, if I remember rightly, an afternoon assembly or a lunchtime assembly. I can remember the old schoolhouse with these big wooden steps that we used to have to line up on for assemblies, and assembly had just started when one of the teachers, I assume it would have been the head teacher, called my sister and myself out, and I can't tell you who was waiting for us, but I believe it was either Mum or Dad, I think probably Dad, who took us home, where we were then met by other relatives, I think an aunt and uncle, and Dad then went off to the hospital, and that is really the extent of the memory of the day. Trying to remember it's very difficult, but Hilary was in hospital for a number of days before they decided that she wasn't going to recover, and they agreed to turn off the life support machine. I don't think Mum and Dad blanked it out. Obviously it was far more difficult for those, and they did go through the horror of the hospital and what have you. But I think they did their best to make sure that any memories, photographs were happy ones, positive ones. At the end of the day, they had 2 other children who were still relatively young, and I think they concentrated on making sure that we got on with a normal life as best as possible.
There is a lot of variability between people in the ability of remembering and forgetting things, especially traumatic events. And what is really important is to consider the fact that when a traumatic event is very difficult to deal with and it's very difficult to live with that memory, then suppression or repression of that event is what usually happens, and that's what usually helps people in keep going on without being bothered by keeping conscious that traumatic event.
Memory for traumatic events can go either way. You can fail to remember traumatic events. That's referred to as psychogenic amnesia. Freud talked about this, that you repress memories that are somehow harmful to you, that you would have difficulty dealing with. There are actually neurobiological reasons why that might happen. During a traumatic episode, you release stress hormones, cortisol and so forth, and those hormones can have an effect on the encoding of memory. The other side of the coin is when you remember a traumatic episode too well, and that's PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Where you recall the traumatic episode in vivid detail and over and over again.
I don't really remember much from sound and smells other than dance shows with all the girls screaming and the hairspray, but that's basically all I remember. I don't have any vivid memories from sounds or smells.
Yeah, I think most of the memories, childhood memories I have, are triggered by primarily smell. I can always smell, or always remember washing days at home with the smell of the soap and what have you. I can also remember the smell of my granddad's greenhouse. In fact, it would have been the tomatoes as you walked in on a hot day. The smell of the tomato plants reminds me of my granddad quite strongly.
Smells: lavender, jasmine, roses, and seeing asparagus growing its fern, because we had all of those in the garden and they were delightful.
Memories are often multimodal, so they contain elements of visual memories, olfactory memories, smells, and so forth. It's possible that certain kinds of memories tend to be either visual or olfactory. So, for example, as we evolved, our ancestors, their vision wasn't as good, and so for some of them at least, olfactory memory was more important. Now, then of course the olfactory memory is useful for the basic functions: feeding, reproduction, mating, and kind of socio-emotional stuff like that. The idea of brain evolution is that we didn't just kind of evolve a brand new brain that replaced our old brain, if you like. Instead, the old brain is still in there, and the new brain has kind of grown on top of it and allowed us to do things like high-level visual function. But that old brain is still there, and so that's perhaps why some of our olfactory memories tend to be more emotional or more linked to these basic functions.
So vision is very important, and we consider vision our strongest sensory modality, and we have to consider that the majority of our experiences and the related memories have a very strong visual component. However, we have to consider that in the memory process, at the beginning of the memory process, there are many different short-term storages that are activated and are recruited depending on the sensory information that we are trying to memorize. This means that we have a sensory short-term storage for visual input, another one for auditory input, and another one, for example, for haptic input, that are the tactile stimuli that we receive. And so this means that although vision is very important, there are different sensory modalities that are involved in the memory process, and there are different sensory storages that are initially involved in the memory process.
One thing that interests me is that there's a kind of paradigm, a way of approaching the organization of the brain in cognitive neuroscience that is kind of like that the brain is a Swiss Army knife, and that there are all these different tools for these different functions, and that they're located in different boxes in the brain. And this is true for memory too. So you have event memory, perhaps, and it's thought to be over here in this box, and say perceptual memory, perceptual learning and memory, or perceptual discrimination, that's over in this box. And that's what I think most people think. And I guess I just don't think it's quite that simple. I think that these functions are distributed throughout the brain. There's no part of the brain that is where all our memories sit. The whole brain is capable of the processes that are thought to happen between neurons, brain cells. When a memory is laid down, those processes happen everywhere in the brain. The whole brain is plastic and capable of memory, not just one isolated bit. I find that interesting because I think that's the way it is. Most people think otherwise.
The most interesting things about memory is the feeling that are associated to memories. It's not the memory itself, it's not what we remember, what we don't remember, but it's the smell and the sound and the taste that every time we think about something that happened in the past comes out suddenly. So it's the strength of the experience that is very interesting in the memory process.